Welcome to our Thanksgiving special for Culturally Appropriate. We have, as always, a packed show for you today. First, I'm going to talk about a piece that I wrote in the Pamphleteer yesterday on the classic sitcom My Three Sons and a Thanksgiving special from 1960 that has a lot to say about contemporary issues. Next, our main course, if you will, is going to be a conversation with Dr. Jeff Fynn-Paul, who wrote an outstanding new book called Not Stolen: The Truth About European Colonialism in the New World. And you will notice how dog-eared my copy is. I'm a massive fan of this book, and I am thrilled to have a chance to have Jeff on the show today. And as always, we're going to end with our weekly film rundown, which happens a little early this week because of all of the Thanksgiving releases. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Now, I know a lot of people may or may not be familiar with the television show My Three Sons, which aired for 12 seasons starting in 1960. But it's a great sitcom, was kind of a Nick at Night staple in the 1990s. And last year, when I was living in Savannah, Georgia, I had this weird experience where I was just walking down Broughton Street, looking at some various shops in the tourist district. You know, there's like competing honey shops, red ribbons in the window decor. And I stopped at this community theater and saw this massive sign that was a land acknowledgement about how they were sorry they were on tribal land. And they were promoting a production of Driving Miss Daisy, or, you know, something very, 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 very middlebrow. And it just bothered me to no end. And I couldn't really figure out why. And during Thanksgiving season, I happened upon this episode of My Three Sons when I was visiting my parents called Chip's Harvest. And it was really profound. It was something I've found with television, especially in the early 1960s. If you think about shows like Andy Griffith or My Three Sons or Leave It to Beaver, they're a lot more ethically complex than contemporary TV. You know, even something like Mad Men or Justified. There's just some weight to these shows that just isn't there anymore, and really kind of went away in the 80s. And in this episode, if you're familiar with the show, it's kind of like a proto Full House. Fred MacMurray, famous actor from Billy Wilder's The Apartment, plays Stephen Douglas, who is a father, a widower, and he's raising his three sons with the help of his wife's father, Bub. Hijinks ensue on the show always. One of the great things about the show is it is available for free on YouTube, and I've linked to this episode in my article, so you'll have a chance to actually watch the episode if you want to. It's one of the nice things about hosting a show like this is we can talk about some of these cultural products that may not get as much recognition or might be half forgotten. So he's raising his three sons, and in this particular episode, they're all excited about Thanksgiving dinner. One son brings his girlfriend, one son brings a teacher, and kind of the subtext of that is he's trying to get dad married again. And the youngest son, Chip, who we see outside playing here, brings Johnny Squanto, who is a local handyman who has Indian origins. And the other characters in the show mock him, and they don't want him to come to Thanksgiving dinner. Even the father expresses reservations. There's this amazing scene where he goes to visit Squanto in the shanty house that he has beside the train tracks. And essentially, he kind of comes to an understanding. And the main part of the show is that the stove goes out on the fritz on Halloween or on Thanksgiving, because obviously it's Thanksgiving, it's a sitcom, something funny like that has to happen. And Mr. Douglas is running all around town trying to find an electrician. Johnny Squanto ends up cooking the turkey in the ground. So there's some noble savage tropes in this show, but at the same time, the way that it deals with natives is really, really profound. Squanto comes out in his headdress and all of his native attire and gives this really great speech at the end of the show about how the white man and the Indian have to exist with each other, have to acknowledge each other. There's no shame. You know, this isn't like a white privilege debate, but you see the characters are clearly humbled. You know, it's just kind of a perfect episode of classic TV, and so much more nuanced than a lot of the land acknowledgement discourse that's going on today. You know, some really great articles have been written about this, like IBM or Microsoft is having a conference and they'll give a land acknowledgement, and it's just so self-righteous and so ridiculous, and really is an indicator of actual white privilege. So it's important for us to go back and look at cultural products from around the times that seem antiquated, because oftentimes we can learn something from them. So if you're interested in Chip's Harvest, there's a link to the really high quality episode on YouTube. You can read my article at the Pamphleteer's website. And that's all I have to say about that. So I'd like to introduce our main guest for today, Dr. Jeff Fynn-Paul. So Jeff, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, and the timing could not have been more perfect. So your book is not stolen. The Truth About European Colonialism in the New World. It's an amazing book. I mean, it's fairly long, and I was able just to like sit down and read it. And I mean, I went through an entire highlighter, which hasn't really happened, I can say, on text as I
Wonderful.
was reading them. So, this book is what I like to call radically objective. Um, it wasn't a book that is like passing itself off as having this groundbreaking primary source research, but what you've done is you've sort of recrafted a narrative of, and really your subject, I feel like, in this book is not so much European colonialism, but the fact that scholarship has basically been retconned over the past 10 years or so is sort of what my reading of the book was. So before we get started talking about the particulars, because I'm really excited to have this conversation, could you tell us how this particular book relates to your regular research interests and what motivated you to write it in the first place?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I do global history. I am in the Netherlands right now. I sort of got hounded out of the American job market 10 years ago, but that's another story. And the Dutch really like economic historians, and I have a specialty in economic history, and they like international studies because they're a small country, so they think about, the world in general and their role at the kind of nexus of the world. And so I got into the idea of global slavery for a while. So I've written a number of articles on slave systems, large scale throughout the world, not just the transatlantic slave, but Asian slave trades and trans-Mediterranean slave trades. And I also have a specialty in the Spanish Empire. And so looking at slavery in the Spanish Empire, I started looking at the New World. And I realized just how off the rails that a lot of my colleagues have gone in North America over the last decade. And I just started thinking, I'm not even allowed to say that a non-European person took slaves ever, basically. If I write anything about that, my colleagues pounce on me as if I've said something taboo. So I looked into it more and realized that this whole stolen ground trope, the idea that Americans and Europeans had committed genocide in the New World, I mean, those two ideas have just come to the foreground in the last 10 years. They were nothing that historians used to believe 20 years ago. And I thought somebody needs to write a corrective. I guess it's going to be me. It also takes somebody with a global expertise, so that you can really talk about big picture systems, because that's what it takes to counteract a lot of these arguments. Most historians are too specialized, I think, these days to see the forest for the trees.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think one of the opening criticisms that we've got two white guys here that are talking about all of these issues, and we don't have the lived experience to talk about them. Which I guess is the most recent trend that's been happening and really does tend to shut down discourse. But, with that caveat that, people who are not reading your work are just actively dismissing it based on the claims or what they've heard on the internet, what would you say that your central thesis is in this particular text?
Yeah, well, I mean, the central thesis is that we had a pretty balanced view of history until the 2010s. And that if we look at, say, the Cambridge history of the native peoples of the Americas, that the word genocide was mentioned twice by 40 authors in that 6-volume series. It was the comprehensive history of the native peoples. And they didn't mention genocide at all. And this was published about 20 years ago. And now suddenly everybody's talking about genocide. So my central thesis is that we've gotten actually kind of hysterical. We've lost objectivity in our writing of American history. And we kind of need to get back to the scientific basis of things. And this lived experience idea, this idea that who you are, what race you are, helps to determine whether your opinion is valid. Well, that's something that, the medieval church got rid of. They called it a heresy. They called it Donatism. The idea that a certain individual, based on their characteristics, cannot have a valid opinion. And I think, as you say, it's just a way of shutting down science. And anyone of any race is open to being an expert and to being a scientist. It all should come down to your expertise, not who you are.
And something you mentioned a lot in the book, I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways, this is a book that could not have been written if 2020 didn't happen. But there is this sort of tension where you talk a lot about the revisionist histories that have popped up and gone mainstream since the George Floyd killing. And there seems to be this weird tension in that particular time period between science and facts as a related to issues like this versus science and facts and COVID. So you have a lot of the same people who are saying truth is relative, you have to share your lived experience, then saying, trust the science on this global pandemic. So it really is kind of a fragmented year where like there's so much cognitive dissonance that's coming out of these leftist point of views that I can't make heads or tails of it. So earlier when I said that your book, it's not written to be this grandiose, groundbreaking, marketed book. The work that you do is very meticulous. You go back through, as you said, the Cambridge Companion, what used to be considered consensus scholarship that's just sort of been erased, which is why I said that I feel like the book is radically objective. Like, this is not a book that should be controversial, in my opinion. This is also not a book that in any way really should have needed to be written, even though I'm very thankful that you wrote it.
Yeah.
And its central premise seems like this Zenish revisionist history. It's less that this Howard Zinn like people's history of the United States or indigenous people's history of the United States, but you seem to be taking to task people in your field, or in your case, what you say are people who pretend to be in your field and don't have the training over the last 10 years. So would you agree that your project here is restoring historical precedent and research precedent?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm saying we really need to simply go back to the facts and to the sources and read them without an overt political bias. I mean, the main bias that people have right now when they go into it is you have to make Europeans look bad. That's what I see across all scholarship. If you're writing about Europeans, you have to say something snide about them. And so you get things like people are saying that the Jamestown colonists never got along with the Powhatan Indians at all. They were always at war. They were always trying to exploit them. They were always racist. And you go back and look at the sources and you find these people are just hanging out in camps together for weeks on end, obviously trading and partying and carrying on. So right there in the sources, there's just fundamental sense that these people are getting along. And I get people on Twitter, with PhDs absolutely denying that that was possible, and I must be misreading the sources.
My favorite moment in the book, and it's something I allude to in the review that I published in the pamphlet here this morning, is, and I had no idea. I mean, I feel like I learned history from a pretty objective, not leftist teachers whenever I was in middle school and high school, but I was actually taught that one of the main strategies to get rid of the Indians was contaminating blankets with smallpox and distributing them to tribes. And, your book not only disproves that by citing articles that were readily apparent if people had only looked, but also goes into detail, which was something that was absolutely new to me, that Thomas Jefferson actually started an inoculation campaign for Indians and sent smallpox vaccines with Lewis and Clark. I mean, how hard would it be for someone trained in your field to find this evidence?
Oh, I mean, it's right there in Smithsonian Magazine. All you have to do is Google smallpox blankets. You find that the only person who is advocating for the smallpox blankets theory who was ever taken seriously was Ward Churchill, the notorious kind of academic fraud. He was the only guy really trying to prove that smallpox blankets happened on more than one occasion, because all the sources tell us there was only one occasion in all of American history. And so everybody knows that things like smallpox blankets did not happen, but you will not see any of my peers mention that fact. They'll write books about with genocide in the title, but they let the public believe that the smallpox blankets thing was probably going on all the time, even if they don't mention it because they know there's no factual basis. So they know it's there, but they're being actively disingenuous. That's the only thing I can conclude in order to gain plaudits from the New York Times, etc.
So going along with that idea, the idea of these plaudits, we have this image of academics. I mean, you're in the classroom daily, I'm in the classroom daily, and there's this idea that academics are in the ivory tower and they sit around and they get paid to think. And even though they're not paid as much as hedge fund managers, they get a pretty good salary. They're, right at the bottom rung of the upper middle class at the very least. But there's this idea that like their work is far removed from what's going on in the real world, and that's intentional. Something that your book posits that I think is a very, very important point is that's not the case. That academics and their work have dire real world consequences, especially in this day and age where Russia and China and a lot of authoritarian regimes are actually engaging in genocide at the moment. So you actually literally in the book accuse academics of this stripe of having blood on their hands. Can you talk a little bit more about that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I'm being accused by my opponents of, being racist because I say something nice about Europeans. And yet, I would argue that their arguments are actually serving to divide and alienate various groups of Americans. Let's say you're a native youth, and suddenly you're being told by the left that you've always been the victim of genocide. Well, how can you not kind of hate mainstream society, mainstream American institutions, because of what these people are telling you? So I actually believe that my more objective view of history is actually encouraging Native youth to participate in society, to see a more positive view of American history, rather than kind of causing them to maybe drop out of American history, like I would argue my opponents are kind of forcing. And then when you look at the international angle, absolutely. You look on the website of the Chinese government, and they're using my opponent's books about American genocide to spread its propaganda to billions of Chinese people to prove that the United States is just as evil as their government has ever been accused of being. So they're literally using my opponent's work as propaganda to justify, let's say, the invasion or occupation of Tibet or the other things that are going on.
So something
So
else
yeah,
that
that's not ivory tower stuff.
not at all. And something else that I had never really put two and two together, but you make a really compelling point in the book is that most of these scholars who you mention, they're trained Marxists. They have a Marxist ideology. They're trained in a Marxist theoretical lens, which has a noted blind spot because as Marxism was rising and we found out more about the Chinese and the Russian governments, any kind of critique of those governments that tried communism was going to be a way to dilute that Marxist ideology. So what happens is this sense of erasure of Russia and China as colonial countries, even though if you as you prove so nicely in the book, many more people were the victims of actual genocides, of migration issues, of forced migration, just of death and destruction in those two countries than in America over the entirety between Columbus's voyage to today. Um, how do you
Yeah.
think the Academy justifies this? I mean, it seems so obvious.
Well, I mean, honestly, it's the blind side that they have because they've chosen a political team. And it's so, I used to believe that getting a PhD might make you wiser, but I'm less and less convinced of that over the years. I feel like if you don't start out wise, you're never going to get wise. And often education just reinforces the prejudices that you had at the beginning, and it makes you feel like you're more infallible. So, I mean, for example, Russia, yeah, they went through Siberia, literally torturing indigenous people, slaughtering them by the tens of thousands. And in the United States before 1848, only about less than 10,000 Native Americans were the victims of massacre over several centuries up to 1848. And so in Siberia, it was much worse. But of course, during the 20th century, nobody on the left, which meant most historians, would want to criticize Russia in any way, even though they were much more of an indigenous slaughtering culture than our own. It's very strange. But it's just tribalism, political tribalism.
Yeah. And I want to take the point. I mean, a lot of your critics would say that, you're dismissing this atrocity that happened in America as, not a big deal. What would you say to somebody offering that criticism of your book?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think as a global historian, we really need to look at the big picture. So yes, I'm not, first of all, dismissing any atrocities. So any atrocities that did happen in the United States are tragic. I mean, absolutely. But this was known before the modern trends all started. We can continue to acknowledge that, and we should. But if you really want a picture of which countries are better or worse, which is what they're actually arguing, then, for example, if you look at the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, that was pretty awful by many measures. But it was nothing compared to the Japanese hunting down and murdering millions of Chinese people during the same war. And yet they'll say the US was worse than Japan. So that just doesn't make sense. So the kinds of conclusions that they are drawing, if you call them out on it, they'll deny that they're making that kind of conclusion, and they'll accuse you of denying atrocity.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think about, you mentioned a lot of current pop culture in your book. I mean, one of my favorite references, I think it's one of the footnotes whenever you talk about this idea that if the colonists had just left the Native Americans alone, then they would have developed like Namor did in Black Panther Wakanda Forever as this advanced race. And your book takes great pains to lay out that that's not the case. Would you say that we're so opposed to this noble savage idea today? And I know you talk a lot in the book about savage and the changing definition of savage, but would you say that sort of this pastoral view of the Indians as like, Namor and Wakanda Forever is in its own way kind of an essentialist noble savage rhetoric itself?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. No, I mean, I think that it's still European exceptionalism in some ways. It's still these privileged academics painting their own picture as to what Native society was. I mean, and remember, at the time of your My Three Sons episode, the ruling stereotype of Native Americans is that they were very warlike. But then the hippie movement came, and suddenly academics and mainstream Americans decided that natives were peaceful. And so that to me says, that sea change says, we're talking more about what we want to think as, mainstream academics than the facts, which are always going to be a blend of these things and much more complicated than any facile narrative.
Yeah. So something else about the book that I found incredibly interesting, and again, I feel like this is a book that's as much about the purported subject matter as it is about academic history. But your contention is that this mainstream view of Native Americans that has leaked into every facet of our popular culture, from Spirit Halloween stores all the way to Pocahontas, the Disney movie, or Terrence Malick's The New World, is really based on like a handful of maybe half a dozen books that you say are not academically rigorous, that you say upon their release kind of mocked within the discipline. How did we get to a point where these four or five, six books that you mentioned throughout the text, and if you want to mention some of those books for our listeners, that would be great. I feel like it would be good for them to read those books with this book as well. But how did we get to a point where like six scholars that aren't really even in the field are dominating the discourse?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's really wild when I dug into this and found just how few people were often the originators of the most radical ideas. So David Stannard, around the time of Columbus's, what was it, 500-year anniversary, in 92, David Stannard wrote a book called American Holocaust, where he says that, maybe 90 million Native Americans were slaughtered within a few years of the European arrival. Totally exaggerated. Doesn't mention that most of those were by disease. And so most people at the time said, okay, Stannard is a little over the top. Nobody was using the term Holocaust at the time. And yet, since the 2010s, I think what we've seen is a successful morphing of Marxism during the 1990s. Because remember, after 1989, after the wall fell, Marxists in the United States were feeling lost and lonely. They didn't have a sort of spiritual center anymore. And they said, all right, well, we can't talk about class anymore. Let's start talking about race, and let's start talking about gender, and let's start talking about indigenous people, and create a world in which, Europeans are always the oppressor, European males, and everybody else is always oppressed. So it's this Marxist duality. And during Black Lives Matter, during the 2010s, they actually managed to foist all of this on the average American, I think, via social media. I think if it weren't for social media, this would have stayed on campus and it wouldn't have affected that many people. But I also almost see this as a reaction from the left to Obama's presidency. I think that a lot of people were thinking, oh my, we've elected a Black president. He's very popular amongst a lot of Americans. And the left was kind of freaking out as if the raison d'etre, the crying victimhood, was no longer going to be possible. So they very successfully foisted this identity view of things on all of us. And now, as you say, it's hyper racialized and totally crazy compared to what we were thinking 10 years ago.
Yeah. And I'm just shocked by, I wrote an article a few years ago. Well, actually, it was earlier this year, trying to figure out and parse out what I call BuzzFeed theory, which in the classroom, I'm trained as a post-colonialist. And what I was noticing is that as I was in the classroom, my students thought they knew more about the theories than I did because of the fact that they read about them in BuzzFeed articles or on Tumblr. And so much of my teaching went from, trying to convey these nuanced concepts of, hybridity, Orientalism to students, to unteaching them what they learned, because a lot of it is intentionally incorrect in some ways.
Yeah.
So that has been sort of a frustrating turn of the tide that I feel like, I don't know how you're feeling in your classroom, and I don't know how it is in the Netherlands, but, I feel like that has been a major barrier to learning, to the point that a lot of academics that I know are thinking about taking private sector jobs. Is that a similar situation to what's happening where you are?
Oh, yeah. Well, in my field of slavery studies, again, you're not allowed to say when you talk about the transatlantic slave trade that a lot of the people who were sold were originally captured by African leaders. If you say that very basic economic fact, because these people were trafficked across the African continent by who? By Africans, because there was no Europeans there. Totally logical, but if you say that, you get complained to, and you might get the dean coming down on you, depending on how it goes. So I think that things have gotten so over the top that if you try to teach a potentially controversial thing like post-colonial theory, where of course there are some valid points of view, it's worth looking at things from multiple points of view. Hybridity is something I talk about all the time in my book. But if you don't say things in a very black and white, Europe good or Europe bad, everybody else good way, then you get in so much trouble that you get colleagues freaking out, you get petitions signed against you. And you're right, it's become so intolerable in many situations that good people are leaving the academic profession. And we're kind of in danger of leaving the field to the ideologues.
And I feel a sense of guilt over that myself. Like, I feel like that's because of the fact that there are very few people that are speaking out against this. And I don't know that it's that there are very good people speaking out against it. As you talk about in your book, there are a lot of people that once somebody stands up, tacitly will support them, but they're afraid of this very small mob. And it's causing some severe ramifications. We're already seeing that with Gen Z on the job market, where employers are actively trying to not hire them, or they're not able to evolve in their careers because of this. Jonathan Haidt talks a lot about this issue as well. But it seems very tied to something as fundamental as what you're talking about in the book. Is you said you earned your degrees in the States and then moved to the Netherlands. Do you see it as any better in Europe, or is the situation, how does it compare to what's going on in the
Well, I mean,
States?
the epicenter really was in the United States for the critical race theory and the idea that, expertise doesn't matter, but your race and gender matters for whether you're considered valid or not. And again, I see that as a sort of attack on science. And then Canada took it even crazier. I got my PhD from Toronto. But now, up in Canada, they're threatening to outlaw anybody who questions the idea of cultural genocide, which is a very contentious topic. But they're threatening to make it illegal to criticize that idea. So it's pretty crazy up in Canada. But in Europe, there's a language barrier, and so these American concepts do definitely trickle over to Europe, but it takes a little bit longer. I think in France, it's more difficult to penetrate. In the Netherlands, it's a little more permeable. But I think that the older generation at my university in the Netherlands has recently been shocked by what some of the younger colleagues are willing to say and do about my book. And how vehemently opposed to any criticism of anti-colonialism that anybody tries to make. The minute you open your mouth against that movement, they're ready to censor you in a very fierce way. And that's taken a lot of Dutch colleagues by surprise.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about that. I shared this with you as I was prepping for the interview over the weekend, but I came across an article that was purportedly written by one of your students anonymously in a campus publication about what to do whenever you're a professor. And I think Geneva has got a copy of that up here. What to do whenever your professor questions genocide in the New World. I don't know. I mean, you obviously would know more about this than I would, but first of all, the fact that like whoever wrote this clearly hasn't read the book, I think is like the key cornerstone takeaway that we can get from this. But the rhetorical skills of the entire piece were just laughable. I mean, I would be embarrassed if I taught this student how to write, if it is actually a student. So can you talk a little bit about some of the blowback that you're getting? Because from what I've seen on the internet, it's either anonymous or like you were review bombed on Goodreads 4 months before the book even came out. So what kind of professional blowback have you experienced from this view, and also from some of your earlier articles in The Spectator, which, I mean, this is not a new project for you, right? So this is something that you've been thinking about for a few years. So can you sort of walk us through what happens to an academic who dares be contrarian?
Yeah, well, I mean, after the Spectator piece, it did go viral globally, and this was the first time that I wrote on this subject of stolen ground. This was in 2020, and so it was read by many people around the world because they were thirsty for some common sense, I would argue, some blowback against the stolen ground narrative. But at the same time, there were millions of people, including tens of thousands of academics, who were outraged, and especially they used Twitter to pile on me in a wild way. So you actually wake up in the morning knowing that tens of thousands of your colleagues are giving you vulgar emojis and things like that on Twitter accounts. It seems so ridiculously unprofessional. So you get ostracized in that sort of way. And then when the book came out, you're right, this piece that you're looking at now is something that came out about a month before the book debuted, or maybe 2 or 3 months actually. And so this person had not read the book. They had read the write-up on Amazon, and that was enough for the student to publish this article. And what really got to me is when we tried to hold a campus discussion on my book. The admin has actually been good at my university and said, okay, in the name of free speech, we have to be able to hold a discussion about your book, even though it's controversial. And I really applaud the admin for that. But a group of junior colleagues email bombed the professor who was going to debate me and basically tell me that I was wrong. So the person who was going to criticize me was threatened with ostracization by colleagues, and he actually dropped out of the talk because he was afraid that nobody at the department would ever like him again if he debated me and told me I was wrong. So that's the kind of situation we're in. So they literally silence debate, and of course, science, as you know, is all about debating. I mean, in every scientific discipline, history, anywhere else, it's all about experts talking to one another. But now, people who are experts are being shut down if they have the wrong opinion, and this is it's not only censorship, but it's an attack on the scientific method itself.
And that's something that I found very chilling, since I was a student, because I remember when I was an undergrad, we would have these amazing debates that our issues committee would set up where like Paul Bagala and Fred Barnes would talk about an election, or, Ron Jeremy, the porn star, would debate an evangelical Christian about the merits of porn. Obviously the evangelical Christian or Ron Jeremy are not really going to find a place at the academy teaching, but, those were ideas that culture is entertaining that were then moved into an academic setting moderated by an academic. And over the past 10 years or so, I have seen these events kind of fall by the wayside. To me, that's how you learn. I mean, it goes back to the Gerald Graff idea of teaching the controversies. But the fact that a debate like the one you were proposing wasn't able to happen because of, what's essentially cyberbullying, it seems like.
Yeah.
It's just really profoundly disturbing to me in so many ways. How has it affected the long-term goals of your career? Because, we know any American that gets a PhD at an American university, our goal is always an R1 institution or to teach at an Ivy League. But, even the idea of tenure, which is supposed to protect academic freedom, now that's in danger and can be used as a weapon or a bludgeon to silence people that are actually doing research that questions the status quo. So, I mean, how did you weigh the professional consequences of the research that you were about to publish with sort of your drive to get this research out?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I definitely have tenure and I'm at a major research institution. So I kind of have the dream career here. And I'm teaching big classes with 500 people because I'm a popular lecturer. And so they gave me this nice platform, in which I keep things as neutral as possible, by the way. I mean, that's just what I see as my duty. But yeah, I would not have started speaking out against what I see as my colleagues' kind of cowardly turn against debate and science, if I had not had that job security. And yet, at the same time, I know that there's people like Frances Widdowson up in Canada who wrote a book called "The Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry," where she was exposing the fact that a lot of people who benefit from grants to Native Canadians are actually white lawyers and politicians, and there's a whole industry around this. But anyway, she had tenure at a Canadian institution, and yet they hounded her out. And the rabid response that the junior faculty have taken towards my book, which again is arguing nothing more serious than, oh, 20 years ago we didn't call it genocide, so are you sure it's actually genocide, or are we just making this up? That's the radical proposition that I'm making in my book. But that's enough that I'm afraid that when these people get to more senior positions in 10 years, they may try to hound me out of my university before I retire. So that's definitely possible. But that's what it's like right now if you stand up for free speech.
I mean, and I think this is a question, like the public in general, we talk about these theories going mainstream, but it seems to me that there are a lot more of the silent majority that, are pushing back against this or don't believe it or just going along. A few years ago at a post-colonial conference, I actually I did a paper where I read all of like the self-help industry, Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo books through a post-colonial lens and pointed out just how they were all absolute rubbish and the work of grifters essentially. And I got no questions in the session, but people privately emailed me and said, "Thank you so much for doing this. We had to read How to Be Anti-Racist by Kendi as a requirement for summer before we got back teaching live during COVID." So this is something I feel like a lot of people in academia are just kind of keeping their heads down. We have an incentive from academic publishers to try to get contracts for books of the most extreme stuff possible to sell them. We have a situation now where the last time I was on a hiring committee, one of the professors actually put Black Lives Matter as a line on their CV, like organizing Black Lives Matter protests. And this was a white person. I mean, the system seems fundamentally broken to me and demoralizing for anybody that actually wants to talk about ideas, which seemed to be the cornerstone of what we did 15 years ago. Like, what way forward do you see? I mean, I'm asking this personally, but I'm also asking this in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's very difficult the way the academy hires people. It's done so slowly. They're there for so long that all the people being hired now on the basis of their identity rather than their ideas are going to be there for decades. And I mean, it was already getting pretty bad 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, I didn't get a job in the United States because someone asked me, how would you teach Western Civ? And I said, oh, I would start with Egypt, which was the first chapter of our Western Civ textbook. And then she said, oh, well, that's not Western Civ, that's African civilization. And then I lost the job. So, I mean, that's the kind of prejudice that we're seeing. And if there is not concerted efforts by breakaway scholars, maybe sometimes by governments, but often governments get too heavy-handed, to try to break this system where everyone in the liberal arts can only talk about minorities. I was told to write my PhD on some kind of a minority. But until we break that mold, it is going to be decades until we have a chance of bringing science back to the American Academy, certainly in the liberal arts. But of course, hard science itself is under attack. I mean, in Canada, there's a project in a physics department advocating native Canadian use of physics. So basically pre-Newtonian theories, and they're advocating that this should be used by modern day physicists. I mean, that's the kind of thing. They got millions of dollars to study optics from Native American oral narratives in a physics department.
And speaking of medicine, I mean, one of my favorite quotes from the book is whenever the smallpox vaccine was considered by the author that you cite as medical imperialism.
Yeah. Yes, you can do no right.
So for those readers who may not be interested in or may not have the training to be a historian, but are very interested in these issues, very interested in sort of looking at what their children are being taught in school, looking at what colleges to send their universities to, looking at the professors that they're going to be learning from, or just trying to figure out where they stand on this debate. If I asked you to give me the 3 biggest myths about Native representation that we accept as truth but are not rooted in reality, what would those be?
Well, I mean, there's so many. One of the ones that we haven't really touched on is the idea that Native Americans were not sexist, that they had total gender equality, and that therefore, when Europeans came, they established a patriarchy. Well, you look back at Native American society and you find sources from the 17th century where they're saying, they treat their women like slaves. I mean, so women were doing all of the drudge work and the men were just kind of sitting around until it was time to fight. So there were definitely gender roles. They were definitely seen as unequal. And so you see women being taken and traded as slaves, women being assimilated as sex slaves into other tribes. So the idea that they weren't sexist, there's, a little bit to that in certain instances, but generally speaking, they were just as sexist as any other group anywhere else on Earth in pre-modern times. Another one is the idea that racial hatred motivated settler actions. Now, this one is completely anachronistic. My chapter on race explains this in detail. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the idea of race as we know it today did not exist yet. People thought that skin color was based on latitude. And so they thought that the natives in Quebec were actually born white. And the reason why they believed that is because they thought they're all at the same latitude. So they were far from the sun. So we're all the same color. And so they also believed that Native American nobility, so chiefs and daughters of chiefs, were actually socially superior to most Europeans. And Cortez believed this, and Pocahontas was treated as a social superior to most people in Jamestown. So if you think they're a social superior, how is that racism? And then the idea, another one is that the Trail of Tears specifically was a genocide. And this is someone that everybody thinks is true. But first of all, the casualty rate was only 5% on the Trail of Tears. And the Oregon Trail, where Europeans voluntarily went across the North America, the casualty rate there was 9%. So the casualty rate on the Trail of Tears was less than the Oregon Trail. And then you have the fact that almost every group of Americans, except for a small group supported by Jackson, or who supported Jackson, was opposed to this. So Emerson was opposed to it. Many people in the US Senate was opposed to it. The US Supreme Court ruled the Trail of Tears illegal. And many missionaries and popular speakers were against moving the natives to Oklahoma. So the idea that it was a genocide, that it was a policy of deliberate destruction, is basically totally false if you look at the real narrative.
Yeah, and I mean, this one is a very important one for us Nashvillians because, right now the Hermitage is being decked out in its Christmas decorations. And there is that interesting tension with Andrew Jackson because, the mainstream liberal party, the Democratic Party, would not exist without Andrew Jackson. Yet he's also a figure that really started a lot of these issues that are really become pillars of the left. So, he's necessary, but he's also expendable, and they can't really figure out what to do with him, which brings me to really what I think is my favorite part of your book. And it is the really deft way that you use post-structuralist criticism against yourself. I mean, there's a lot of ironies here. One of them being that you said the French are the ones that have really launched against this like CRT-ified version of theory, even though Derrida and Foucault were really the reasons that exist in the first place. But, you have these really wonderful quotes in the book that, capitalism didn't exist, but neither did not capitalism. It was an economic system. Or settler colonialism, by definition, reinforces Western exceptionalism. So you're really turning this theoretical bent on its head and using it to its obvious purposes. To me, anybody that reads Foucault reads Derrida. And, I will say that I got a lot out of this. I took a Marxist theory class whenever I was in grad school, and it was one of the most helpful classes because it did allow me to see texts through the vein of economics in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. My post-colonial training the same way, like Orientalism. Said, despite his obvious political activism, was an astute enough scholar to, write detailed, nuanced work that had a lot of practical applications.
Sure, he was onto something.
Absolutely. A scholar that's trained in this, that understands the theory, should be aware of these blind spots. But we would not be having the problems that we are having today if they were. So, I mean, do you think that academics are intentionally being intellectually dishonest? Or do you think that they realize it, or are they just so caught up in the politics and what they emotionally believe is right to really put their methodology on the line?
Well, what's really kind of sad is I think that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, intellectuals were still coming out of the mid-20th century absolutist mode of thought, where they were thinking that there was one set of rules that had to govern the way they viewed the world, whether this was some form of Marxism or otherism. And then I thought that in the 1990s, once Marxism faded out of favor, that we had moved to a pluralist world where intellectuals didn't really believe in any one theory, and we just wanted to look at the evidence. We became empiricists and more inductionists, where we said, let's start with the evidence first, rather than deductionists starting with a theory in the old-fashioned way. And so I thought we had moved to a more practical state in academia, where theory was totally out of fashion, and I didn't think I would see it arrive in my lifetime, or at least in my career. And yet now, from the 2010s, we see the resurgence of theory again, and we find academics all thinking that they have to look at the world through a single prism, such as CRT. And I think to myself, didn't we do that in the 70s and 80s and realize that it was kind of juvenile? It was kind of infantile to think that any one theory can explain the whole world. I thought we had moved past it, but I think with the rise of social media and the mob mentality that comes with it, there's maybe too much of an incentive for people to cling to a theory as a sort of tribalist thing. And so they're making the same mistakes as they were in the 70s and 80s. And I think intellectuals just have a propensity to try to simplify their world into a set of theories. And I'm really just kind of, again, disillusioned that we didn't learn from that mistake.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of joked with you in our email exchange leading up to the interview that like I fundamentally agreed with your assessment of post-colonial theory in the book, but one of the problems with those of us that are trained in that discipline is when this theory is abused. I mean, your assessment of post-colonial theory as basically claptrap at this point is correct because it's being used in that way. But what happens for those of us that are trained in this theory that do use this lens in practical areas, and even use this lens to look at some of these pop CRT books, it cheapens our discipline. Those of us
Yeah.
trained in it in a way that is not good for the long term. I mean, I had very, very good professors in like the late aughts whenever I was getting my PhD
Mm,
who were clearly progressive. Their Facebook statuses are always, but they were able to separate that from the classroom in like a way that somebody like Stanley Fish would advocate. Like that is not your job in the classroom. Whereas
mm,
now, through the lens of service learning and through the lens of a lot of these academic movements, we are really seeing like activism as part of the course requirements or part and parcel for going to a university. I mean, what do you think people in disciplines like critical theory are losing with the way that they are treating it now, both in their personal
mm.
lives and in the classroom?
I found a great Thomas Sowell quote where he was saying that disciplines like Black studies and gender studies are not science because they insist that students have to believe one take on the evidence by the time they finish their degree, certainly. So African studies or Black studies, which is what Ibram X. Kendi got his degree in, basically presupposes that you're going to think that racism is the root of all evil affecting African Americans, which, is partially true, but it's certainly not entirely true. But you have to believe that that's kind of 100% the case if you're going to go through African studies. So, I mean, I think that these studies, such as gender studies, that are predicated on a certain set of beliefs about history are, again, they're teaching anti-science. They really shouldn't be at a university if they do not teach you to have an open mind. And yet we're seeing the fruits of that kind of very one-sided education, I think, increasingly in our society. It's become almost totally dominant now.
And something that frustrates me on the opposite end are, you have a lot of conservatives, and as you mentioned, like governments being a little too heavy-handed. A lot of this legislation that's meant to torpedo CRT in the classroom does sometimes have the effect of silencing issues, or could be also weaponized. So, I mean, how would you say that somebody that is kind of fundamentally opposed to the trends that we're seeing, and wants to combat them would go about doing that?
Yeah. Well, I
Somebody that
mean,
might be a layman or somebody that might be educated and sort of be looking at this um, as kind of a hobby, or looking at this as something that they feel is a political calling. What's the right way for publicly funded education to get past this moment?
well, I mean, certainly you can work at all levels. So, I mean, work with other parents in your community, get somebody elected to the school board, even on this kind of platform, raise that as an issue. And you can say, look, we're not remotely racist. We just want a balanced view of things. I mean, that's really what this should be all about. And I don't see how that couldn't be popular with most people. Then, there are national political action committees. There are national groups that are moving in support of, the kind of anti-CRT stuff. You have to kind of find the right one. And then there's, the University of Texas at Austin is being founded. So they're a really interesting group to look at as a sort of breakaway set of academics. And so I think there's more and more groups being founded to kind of just promote a balanced view of American history. And people need to look for authors and organizations that they can support, and then actually go out and support them, with your time and or money, just to promote awareness of this. Otherwise, we're going to lose science. I mean, it's almost like we're headed for the dark ages again.
I mean, and so in the time that, I first learned of your book's existence, and obviously before the time of the release, we've had a couple of high profile, almost backtracks. Whenever Ibram X. Kendi's foundation at Boston University was discovered to be like mismanaging funds and buying real estate, and then also Black Lives Matter as a group, being accused and having a lot of their charitable contributions, the groups that were associated taking those contributions left. They've not been widely covered, but you're starting to see, like, there was an editorial in the New York Times, like, CRT wasn't what we should have been doing after all. I mean, do you see this tide turning, or do you think that these are just kind of blips on the radar on the way to something worse?
Well, I mean, I think it can still go either way. I think we're seeing the beginnings of a sort of counterattack, but a lot of it comes with formulating proper rhetoric. I mean, you need to be able to fight these people in the realm of ideas. CRT took over Facebook and everywhere else so entirely by 2020. That now we need reasonable counter arguments. And I'm hoping my book is going to be at least some small part of helping to formulate these arguments. But it's still very much a nascent process. It's still a work in progress. And, there's a lot of forces arrayed against us. There's a lot of big money in universities paying people to be chairs of intersectionality. And it's going to definitely take some doing. This is going to be a long fight.
So I'd highly recommend, Christmas is coming right down the corner of the holidays. This book, any historians, anybody that's interested in history, I would highly recommend read the book. I think all academics, especially those in my field, should read this book. Your book is done. There's a sense of relief, I'm sure, for you now that this process is over. So what's next for you in terms of your research and other opportunities that have come up?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's a question of, do I wade into the culture wars and write sort of a history of the concept of white supremacy, which shows its ugly side, but also how it's been blown out of proportion by Ibram Kendi and people like that? Or do I look at some big theories of global history? Like, I'm thinking of something on the equations of global history and how one could write these to kind of show the sinews of how the world really works. And then another big one that I think is very important is a history of democracy in the long run, because people, again, I think young people are thinking authoritarianism is okay or not that bad. And I think that we need a robust history in defense of democracy in order to keep that spark alive. I think we're in danger of losing that. These are all options, and I'm kind of working on all three of them. So we'll see what comes next.
Well, I know I, for one, am really grateful that you're doing the work that you're doing. And I'm looking forward to an opportunity to be able to teach this text alongside some of the more traditional post-colonial theory in the future. So I would highly also recommend following Jeff on X. He's got a really great page there. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope our viewers have gotten as much of this out of this conversation as I have.
You're welcome. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation as well.
Have a great one.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye. And we definitely also want to thank Jeff for joining us from the Netherlands, which I know it's getting late into the evening there. Again, not stolen. Highly recommend reading this book. Highly recommend giving this book as a gift. Very well written, great narrative, very engaging. I don't want to say that I wasn't able to put it down, but that was actually the case. When I got a chance to read it, I spent an entire day just finishing it up. So we're going to end today, as always, with our weekly film rundown. And there's still a lot of movies from last week that are in theaters. Thanksgiving tends to be one of the bigger movie-going times of the year. So let's go ahead and get started with what has been the release that's gotten the most impact so far, which is Ridley Scott's Napoleon movie. Um, One of my favorite things about film culture over the past couple of weeks has been Ridley Scott on this press tour for Napoleon. The movie stars Joaquin Phoenix as Napoleon and Vanessa Kirby as Josephine. And Scott, I guess because he's in his 80s and just doesn't care anymore, has just been going after his critics. The French apparently hated this movie, and Scott's response on the press tour was that the French don't even like themselves. He made a joke about how he has made 4 movies since Martin Scorsese started Killers of the Flower Moon. So we sort of see Ridley Scott unhinged. I saw yesterday Francis Ford Coppola, director of The Godfather, was a big fan of this movie and wrote sort of a tribute to Ridley Scott in his career. I'm looking forward to seeing it. I know Davis Hunt, editor of The Pamphleteer, is looking forward to seeing it because he is a big Napoleon fan. You had Rob Way on our show last week who played Napoleon or a Napoleon impersonator, and a project Davis and I worked on a few years ago. So I want to see Joaquin as Napoleon. I am highly looking forward to this release. It's probably one of the bigger releases of the holiday season, and it's also something that originally was made for Apple TV, but is being released in theaters. So I would say see it on the biggest screen possible. Next, we have the movie Saltburn. Saltburn is a film directed by Emerald Fennell, who made Promising Young Woman, a really nuanced kind of feminist movie that won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. And this is a horror comedy of manners in which an Oxford student, played by Barry Keoghan, who was the Joker in the Robert Pattinson Batman movie and was in Dunkirk and The Banshees of Inisherin, he gets drawn into this aristocratic world of a classmate played by Jacob Elordi from Priscilla and Euphoria, and all kinds of intrigue ensues. The movie looks really fun. It looks really well shot. I'm hoping to see it as soon as possible as well. We also have Disney's latest release, Wish, which is about an anthropomorphic star who comes to life after a young girl wishes upon it. And she takes down an evil magician with the help of a talking goat that's ready-made for Funko Pops and stuffed animals and all kinds of licensing this Christmas season. I made the obvious pun about Disney needing to get the magic back, and this movie actually has the lowest Rotten Tomatoes score of any Disney release in over 20 years. I'm probably going to go see it just to keep current, but I don't think this one's going to be a winner. I was reading over the weekend in Deadline Hollywood where Trolls Band Together came out last week, and 10 years ago, no other family movie would be released within a month of a Disney movie like Frozen. And now Universal didn't even see it as a big deal to release Trolls 5 days before this movie because they don't see it as competition. So we've got 2 options for the family there in Trolls and Wish, and that's great. Another release that's coming out that's going to be playing at the Belcourt this weekend is Dream Scenarios starring Nicolas Cage. This is a release from A24, and it's directed by Christopher Borgli, who made the outstanding film Sick of Myself earlier this year that I wrote an essay on for the Pamphleteer. And in this movie, Nick Cage is a mild-mannered professor, and he inexplicably starts showing up in the dreams of everyone on the planet. So it's this nice discussion of fame and fortune. It's got kind of a surreal Spike Jonze aspect you see here in the trailer. So this movie is actually playing today at the Belcourt as with a double feature of Sick of Myself, which by all accounts looks like a much lower key movie than one, but Borgli is one of the great fresh new talents of the film scene. So this movie has actually even gotten better reviews than Sick of Myself. So definitely a film that I'm making time for. The Belcourt also has another couple options this weekend. They're doing a restored version of Alfred Hitchcock's classic, The Man Who Knew Too Much, starring Doris Day and Jimmy Stewart as a couple whose son is kidnapped while they're vacationing in Morocco. This will be playing all through the holiday weekend. The Belcourt also has a really great midnight movie series this weekend. At least it used to be every week, but at least bi-weekly, the Belcourt releases midnight films, and they just kind of show older movies that have a cult following in 35 millimeter, DCP. And this week brings the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original by Tobe Hooper from 1974, and a movie that I feel is vastly underrated, The Strangers, with Scott Speedman and Liv Tyler, that came out in 2008. So, both of these movies are about killer families in their own way. You're definitely going to be getting a different type of meat if you watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre than you'll be having on your Thanksgiving plate. But for those of you that want to get out of the house, see some horror, I've already seen the outstanding new Eli Roth movie, Thanksgiving. This might be an option for you as well. So between these releases and last week's big releases like Thanksgiving, like Trolls, this proves to be a really fruitful time for going to the movies. And I would encourage everybody to get out, see something on the big screen. And that does it for our special event for Thanksgiving here on Culturally Appropriate. Thanks so much for spending some of your day with me, and I will see you all after the holiday. Whatever you do, make sure to give it some thought.